Hi. Thanks, Sasha. Great to see you all, plus our in-person audience and the virtual ones. My name is Sasin Jakovic. I teach at the Russian and Slavic Studies at NYU, and today it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to the first event of the year of the Jordan Center. And it is a very auspicious one. We're really delighted to host Josepina Ranaker, an associate professor of Russian language and literature at the University of Kocherab in Italy. Josepina is the author of the biography and the letter Iris, Traces of Russian Culture in Florence from 1899 to 1939. Which came out from the University of Pisa Press in 2018. She has also published numerous articles on 19th and 20th century Russian prose, Russian emigre literature, Russian intellectual history and literary criticism, Italian and Russian cultural relationships. She is currently completing her work on a book provisionally entitled Biografiia, Lech Pumpianski Beyond Classical Philology and Literary Criticism, which will come out at Academic Studies Press. So we'll talk today on the concepts of personality and an author, a comparative study with Lech Pumpianski and Grigory Vinepur, comes out with her research on the book. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Austin. And good morning to everybody here in person, and of course, good morning everybody also online. It is very honored to be here today, and let me express my gratitude to all the NYU colleagues for hosting and organizing this event, and also allowing my research stay here at the NYU during this period was very important for me. So I'm very I'm very grateful to Andrei Rosenjagarov, Ilya Kliger, and of course to Sasha Shpitali for supporting me in this research stay here during this month. Today we will talk about the two main figures of the Russian intellectual history of the first part of the 20th century, with a particular focus on the idea of authorship. And we will focus on the idea and the concept of personality by Grigory Vinepur and the concept of author by Iris Pumpianski. I will say that actually they have never met during their lives. At least we do not have any evidence about this possible meeting. But that, of course, does not exclude that they read each other or anyway they got in contact. Just thinking up in other circles. I would say that I would start saying that in European and American literary criticism, especially from the second half of the 20th century, the idea of the authorship has attracted enormous attention. Theorists and cultural historians have asked who is the author, what is relationship to the work and to the public, how does the author interact with contemporary society? From Michel Foucault to Roland Barthes, from Philippe Lejeune to Umberto Eco and beyond, many have explored this category, sometimes challenging the very role of the author, sometimes even declaring his death, in order to imagine a literature that could transcend modern subjectivism. In switching, however, to the Russian intellectual history between the 1910s and the late 1920s, we see that these same questions were already very much alive. Critics at that time were not only debating what literature was, or how to distinguish it from other art forms, the so-called formal method, the most controlled linguistic circles, the circle of Mikhail Bakhtin are obvious examples. They were also asking, what is the relationship between literature and society? And in what way, if at all, might the identity of the writer have a function? I think that new concepts and terms began to emerge around subjectivity of literature's main actors and above all around the author. In this talk, I would like to add a small piece to what we might call a Begriffsgeschichte, so a history of the concept of author. This inevitably extends to the concepts of identity and personality. My perspective will be that of Russian intellectual history, which I consider crucial, because on this topic, as on others, Russia is ahead of its time, anticipating many of the discussions that will later animate structuralists, post-structuralists, and beyond. For my case study, as I said, I have chosen these two figures who I believe deserve renewed attention. They are central to the so-called Historia nauki of the 10th and the 20th, yet they remain relatively little studied. The philologist and linguist Grigori Vinokur and the philologist and historian of literature Lev Fumpiansky both were deeply concerned with subjectivity. Vinokur, in particular, focused on the dimension of personality, lichnost, which is a very crucial concept during the 10th and the 20th. Fumpiansky, on the other hand, worked with an intellectual framework, and in his path, he paid a particular attention to the author after. It is worth noting that Vinokur and Fumpiansky, as I said, never met, or at least we do not have any evidence about it. Vinokur was based mainly in Moscow, where he was active in the GAK, so the State Academy of Artistic Sciences, and the Moscow Linguistic Circle. Fumpiansky's career, if we can talk about career because he did not receive so much fortune, took him first to Lviv, then to Vitebsk, and finally to Petrograd and Leningrad. Despite their different trajectories and their different approaches to literature, I would argue that both move within the orbit of key categories in literary theory of the time, and both attempt to define their scope and meaning. Research on Fumpiansky has been carried out above all by Nikolai Ivanovich Nikolaev, his biographer, and an important scholar of his intellectual legacy. So the question of the author has never been systematically studied in this context. We know a very huge of studies and researches about Bakhtin's author and also the studies by Voloshin of Medvedev, but we really do not know actually the Fumpiansky's point of view on this particular topic. I would therefore address this here for the first time by looking at Fumpiansky's intellectual development as a whole. My take is that the problem of the subjectivity in literary history is one of the central issues he pursued from his earliest years of activity, starting in 1919 in Italy. Vinokur has received more scholarly attention, especially since the publication of Maxim Shapir's Biography Исследования in 1999, and those ones by Raya Seitlin, Sergei Gimbin, Vyacheslav Ivanovich Ivanov. But here too, there is still no comprehensive reconstruction of his thought, even if several excellent studies have traced its philosophical and aesthetic sources. The idea of biography in Vinokur's work has been examined most recently by Sergei Zenkin in 2020 in his paper biography, Vinokur, Lotman, Dubin, published in the journal Study Culture. On the topic of personality, Vinokur, as well as the philosopher Gustav Spierter, we have very good studies such as Maria Candida Lidini's seminal 1999 article about the problem of personality, as well as contributions on Vinokur in general, and around him, such as the papers and essays by already mentioned scholars as Seitlin, Gimbin, Ivanov, and also by other academic researchers such as those ones by Michela Venditti and Stefania Sini. More broadly on identity, I would highlight the important work of Nikolai Ivanovich, especially the volume co-edited with Alexander Hardev in German, Discourse der Personalität, die Begriffsgeschichte der Person aus deutscher und russischer Perspektive in 2008, and its recent monograph, Concept der Person, so the centrality of the idea of personality especially, The one that was published just last year. What I'll try to do today is reconstruct how the Socrates approach the categories of author and personality and to convert them in order to understand what interested them, how and why. Let us begin with Pompiansky and examine how identity in its conceptual system is realized through the image of the author. Here is a slide on the main stages of Pompiansky's biography. He was born in Vilna in 1891. He attended the gymnasium together with Nikolai Martin, brother of Mikhail, and with Mikhail Lapatta, later a writer and scholar of Pushkin. He then moved to Petersburg, where he enrolled at the university, but was expelled for not paying tuition fee. In 1919, he moved to Nivy, where, together with Bakhtin and the young philosopher Matvei Kagan, he founded the so-called Medieval Philosophical School, which actually was a circle rather than a school in the strict sense, with a neo-Kantian orientation. In 1921, I then moved to Vitebsk, and I'm sure that on the basis of its words, we can assume that the period in Nivy and Vitebsk was very, very fruitful. For it was during these years that its conceptual system took shape. It studies on classical antiquity, on Dostoevsky's novels, and on the theory of literary genres, which for Pompiansky remained unfinished. He returned then to Petersburg in the very first years of the 20s, the 23, 24, began teaching at the prestigious Tenishik Lyceum, offering courses on classicism and ancient literature, especially tragedy. It was in these years that Pompiansky's concept of classicism was shaped, fundamental also for understanding the role of individuality, first in poetry and then in prose. Then in the 20s, Pompiansky was in contact with Grigory Bukovsky, another crucial figure in his intellectual path. For whom Pompiansky wrote a chapter on Cantemir and Trydakovsky in the history of 18th century literature in 1939. Then Pompiansky continued to write on the classical tradition in Russian literature, with particular reference to authors such as Pushkin, Gogol, and Dostoevsky, and extended his studies to the contemporary European and American literature. In 1929 and 1930, he wrote the still unpublished book, The Literature of the Contemporary West and America, so Literatura Современного Запада и Америки. Then in 1927, 1928, meanwhile, precisely in the same year when Dinapour's biography and culture was published in Moscow, he distanced himself from his earlier neo-Kantian formation, broke ties with many of his associates, among them Konstantin Vaginov, who in the Goethe song caricatured Pompiansky, and declared that he was taking up Marxist positions. This Marxist term was not decisive, or rather, Pompiansky's attention to the relationship between literature and society was not limited to the late 1920s, but had interested him since 1923, 1924, when he studied Russian classicism. From the late 1920s and throughout the 30s, he devoted himself with particular intensity to the works of Ivan Turgenev, who in his theory of the novel, unfinished, in my view, but novelist presence, occupies a key role. And then he died in 1940. Unlike Dinapour, Pompiansky is not systematic. That is one of the main differences between these two scholars. That is, his idea of the author is scattered across numerous essays, from the text philosophical ones of 1919 to those of the late 30s, devoted to Russian classicists, which in any case are strongly influenced by his earlier research. Pompiansky's approach has been defined by Nikolai Ivanovich Nikolaev as an encyclopedisme hypothesis, or an encyclopedizacja problem. That is, especially the encyclopedizacja problem, is the definition used by Kumpiansky in the unfinished essay Historia ruskого classicism. Echoing, of course, this definition of Kumpiansky himself. But what does it mean? It is a method that identifies thematic nuclei in evolution, transformed over time from antiquity to contemporary. And I would describe Kumpiansky's approach exactly as I believe discipline litteram. What's interesting is to identify the key concepts in the history of ideas on the basis of which individual cultures have measured themselves. In this light, Kumpiansky intends to reconstruct the history of concepts within a general vision in which history is understood in an Hegelian sense, that is, as a constant process of change and transformation, in which a continuous dialogue between generations of artists and also authors takes place. These are sort of the methodological premises I have been able to reconstruct, because Kumpiansky's work is represented by an heterogeneous corpus of texts written, as we can see in this slide, between 1999 and 1939, often in the form of notes and incomplete essays, although they are also finished as published contributions, such as those devoted to individual figures like Kantemir, Lomonosov, Tryagowski, Gogol, Dostoevsky, and Turgenev. So we have a very wide range of authors and time. In my view, for Kumpiansky, the idea of the author is placed within a broader vision, where the central issue is that of individuality and subjectivity, that is, when and how identity develops in literary and cultural history. Which is the starting point? So where to start from? The starting point for Kumpiansky is, in my opinion, antiquity. That is a very crucial point in his idea of history of literature, generally speaking, because similarly to Alexander Vygotsky and his historical poetics, but also to the classical philologist Tadeusz Żiliński, Kumpiansky considered antiquity the custodian of images, motives, and elements that are reiterated, revitalized, and renewed. In antiquity, but especially the Greek one, the figure of the aordos plays an exclusive role. For Kumpiansky, the aordos is the figure who is entrusted with the task of singing heroic feats, of preserving collective memory according to a precise project, as was typical for classical Greek literature, the project of the music. And here we have another issue. What does Kumpiansky mean when he constantly refers to the muses, also on the plural form? He means again using the tools of classical philology to understand the history of literature. Indeed, the muses, in fact, are a recurrent opus in Kumpiansky's idea of classicism, which in fact implies the essence of individuality. No chance, the classical aordos has no identity. He does not sing and describe on his own behalf, but only according to a diamond plan. Restoration of the muses bestows upon him the gift of song. And in the small volume, Dostoevsky in Antiquity, which was published in Petrograd in 1922, but actually was already, the text was really at the very end of the tense, Kumpiansky writes, самом деле, классическая культура предполагает многочисленность повышенных авторитетов, монументальность предметов, тянуть ею символическую жизнь. Ее предметный мир есть поэтому система высококвалифицированных предметов. Солнце, дом, одежда, меч. What is fundamental in this passage? It is the ideal of the heightened authority, a superior level of authority in which the author has no agency of his own. What happens then in the subsequent history of literature, according to Pompiansky? Pompiansky turns to classicism, and in particular to Russian classicism, which he parodized as a contemporary so-called long 18th century. That is from 1739, with Lomonossov's ode on the capture of Kharkiv, through Pushkin's Raven Sad in the 30s. Within that span, Pompiansky identifies a decisive shift. The image of the authors transforms into that of the poet. A common poet, above all, who sets and proclaims a higher project, namely the imperial project, the project of the Tsar. That is therefore a second moment in the history of the concept of identity, the emergence of the poet. Linked to the idea of the poet in the concept of style, which also interested Vinokourov. For Pompiansky, in the literature of classicists, style arises precisely at the point where the relationship between poet and higher project is reproduced, more specifically, the project of exalting the Tsar and the empire. For Pompiansky, Lomonossov, for example, is the first poet of classicists because it's the poet of enthusiasm and thus of the style. So he recalls the first verse of the Kharkivskaya Oda, Vastor Vezar Umplinu. So we have a Vastor, we have an enthusiasm. But what happens next to the image of the poet? With historical and social processes by the 1770s, the image of the poet is challenged by another key figure in Pompiansky's conception of classicism and also authorship, Gavrila Dzerzhavin. In contrast, to the immediately preceding tradition, above all Lomonossov, Dzerzhavin, according to Pompiansky, breaks the bond of subordination between poet and Tsar. He opens the way to subjectivity, to the appearance for the first time in Russian literary history of the lyrical dialogue. In his attention essay towards a history of Russian classicism, Pompiansky speaks of the transformation of the official oath on the destinies of the state into, he writes, a norm of private life. So in Russian, превращение официальной оды о судьбах государства в личной жизни. So we are at the very beginning of the 20s. This leads to what Ilya Sirman in 60s, especially in a very crucial study published in 1968, drawing on Pompiansky's reflections, later called Dzerzhavin's autobiographies. What does Pompiansky mean to show? While Lomonossov the poet is the voice of many individual traits and sings on behalf of its nation, the political ideal of the sovereign, with Dzerzhavin and with oaths such as Divitsa or Fortune, we witness, according to Pompiansky, the appearance of a concrete poetic personality, who for the first time in Russian literary history speaks in the first person. With Dzerzhavin, in Pompiansky's interpretation, the individuality of the poet is swerved, takes on decisive weight. The central theme is no longer the exaltation of imperial power, but rather, on the contrary, its critic and even mockery, reflected also in his use of a non-solemn, mixed style, what Dzerzhavin himself called the Zabarny Ruski slog, in music Russian style. Pompiansky does not yet speak explicitly of personality as Vinokourov would, but is in fact pointing to the same thing. The individual expression of the author, who drawing on his lived experience, Dzerzhavin's personal relationship with the Empress is well known, employs a style very different from the elevated style of Lomonossov. And what comes after this? The situation changes once more with Pushkin, the representative of the last classicist and also representative of another stage of the authorship. In Pushkin, the image of the poet gradually shifts into that of the author. Authorship emerges at the moment when Pushkin denies the existence of the muse, and with it, in higher projects that have inspired the classical art. For Poljanski, a crucial text here is the Pushkin's Exegi Monumentum, where Pushkin writes, Muza, будь послушна. In other words, it is the poet, the author in the strict sense, who decides what, how, and when to sing. For Poljanski, therefore, the author takes shape at the very point of emancipation from the muse, and in the Russian case, from the exaltation of the imperial project and the figure of the Tsar. The studies for which Poljanski both fully engages with the author, devoted to Dostoevsky and later to Turgenev. So, as we could say, just from a diachronical perspective. Here, the category of author reaches its fullest development, and even beyond, for it extends into the author's relationship with the object of his creation, the hero. To be precise, in Dostoevsky and Antiquity, the central theme is not the author as such, but the hero. A key category of what Poljanski considers to be a genuine theory of prose. In his first definition of the figure of the hero, that Poljanski also gives substance of that of the author, and especially in rights, and we could see how it combines different literatures. Герой становится конкурентом своего поэта. Один и тот же сюжет сочиняется дважды в Шекспира и Гамлета. So here is just talking about the English literature. Here the dialogue with Bakhtin reaches its highest intensity. And we can see that Bakhtin's Dostoevsky is not a product of the late 20s, but already of the late 1910s. For Bakhtin, the confrontation with Poljanski must have been sudden. In Dostoevsky and Antiquity, Poljanski insists of defining the hero, not limiting himself to Dostoevsky, but bringing him into relation with Shakespeare and Hugo, with works such as Hamlet, The Brothers Karamazov, and Les Miserables. He writes that in all these three cases, the protagonist inhabits a parallel dimension that a dream or sleep. For Hamlet, it becomes the path that leads the Prince of Elsinore to madness. For Jean Valjean, the dream revealed the consciousness of a protagonist torn between revealing or concealing true identity of Mayor Madeleine. For Raskolnikov, the dream conceals the most hidden impulses of the murderer. He himself no longer knows whether he is in fact acting in reality or whether he is in the grip of yet another delirium. And that is important, I think, passage about the not only these three different contexts, but also the idea of personality and authorship. Always in Dostoevsky and Antiquity. Jean Valjean, как и Гамлет, как и Раскольников, хотел пробовать только невыраженной реальностью логической жизни. Жабер и его полиция врываются в этот поделенный сон, как голос давно отставленного, давно брошенного мира, проданного героя за божество невозмутимого и притом своего собственного сна, собственный сон. Борьба здесь происходит между реальностью истории и иллюзорностью персональности. Иллюзорностью персональности. What does this passage mean? It means that the very category of the author's personality is suppressed. For the author begins to lose control over his own hero. The hero slips away and acquires a personality, personalность, of his own. Jean Valjean, Hamlet, Raskolnikov are for Poljanski the products of an author who no longer has power over the plot or over its protagonist. The trajectory itself, we can just summarize this idea of authorship with this life. The trajectory that Kompiansky traces regarding authorship thus moves from the authors to the poet, then to the author, and finally to the gradual annihilation of the author who yields the stage to the hero. It is no coincidence that when it comes to studying the novels of Turgenev in contrast to those of Dostoevsky, Kompiansky speaks of the novel of the hero, the heroic roman, or romance geroia. A novel in which the fate of the protagonist is central, a protagonist who revolves around himself and searches for his own identity. This type of novel, Kompiansky argues, leads directly to the modernist novel of Proust, Joyce, and Kafka. Authors Kompiansky himself studied, in which neither author nor hero retains any role, and what matters instead is the very essence of the plot. What Kompiansky formulates here is clearly in dialogue with Bakhtinian aesthetics, though, and I'm pretty sure about it, with important differences. In his first essay on philosophical aesthetics, Author and Hero in Aesthetic Activity, dated 1924, Bakhtin examined the characteristics of the relationship between author and hero, considering it the central event of the literary work. For Bakhtin, the work of art results from the interaction of the author's work and the character's work. Author and hero together are essential to define Dostoevsky's polyphonic novel. For Kompiansky, by contrast, the importance lies elsewhere, the history of the concept of the author itself. His reflections belong to the wider line of, I would call, as I said before, avangardist Geschichte, which leads him to study the Russian novel within a European perspective and within the development of literary genres. Let us now turn to Biography and to the concept of lichnost, so personality. From the outset, it should be said that Inakour's notion of personality is undoubtedly in dialogue with one of the recurrent concerns of the four-month method, especially the upheavals, namely the question of literary personality, literaturnaia lichnost. This debate reopened the issue of the author's role in artistic creation, its presence within the work, and the subtle and complex relations he entertained with biographical personality, biografiia lichnost, and with biography, biografiia. It was, however, I would say, largely a new dialogue, since Vinokour's text had very little resonance. As far as I've been able to ascertain, was not cited at all by his contemporaries. This does not, of course, mean that it was not read, but it does suggest that it had little impact on the literary criticism of the time. The most significant contribution by Vinokour for understanding what he meant by personality is Biografiia e Cultura, a work published in 1927. It was reviewed only once the same year in the English journal Biografiia. In Russia itself, it had no real reception, in contrast to some of Vinokour's linguistic works, which were periodically discussed and taken up again by his contemporaries. The question of literary personality, so literaturnaia lichnost, and it can emerge already in the early 1920s and proved from the outset to be both complex and multifaceted. It appears in the works of the representatives of upheavals, Tomaszewski, Utinian, and Boris Eichenbaum. In 1923, in literature and biography, Tomaszewski insisted on the need to distinguish literary personality from the personal biography of the author. By literary personality, literaturnaia lichnost, he meant a kind of myth or anti-myth of the writer, determined by success or favored with the reading public. In fact, Tomaszewski anticipates here what decades later will become the focus of reader-oriented studies. He wrote that there are writers with biography, biography, and writers without biography, biography. In the first case, so the case of writers with biography, a specific myth crystallizes around the writer, and this myth plays a crucial role in the understanding of his or her works, what Tomaszewski called biographical legends. In the second case, in the case of writers without biography, which multiplies from mid-19th century onwards, the writer's biography has no role in the interpretation of texts. Then in 1924, Tinianov returned to the question of literary personality, but in more theoretical terms. In the literary effect and then our literary evolution of 1927, Tinianov defined literary personality as a style through which the author expresses himself, including his mess. Later on, in 1927, exactly in the year when Vinatour published the Biografia Cultura, Eichenbaum dealt with the personality of the writer, lichnost pisatelja, in literary life, well, literary with literaturni, and in literature and writer. He emphasized the need to study biography in a social historical perspective, with reference, in particular, of course, in this case, to Tolstoy biography, and therefore to understand what constitutes the author. This means relating the writer's life and circumstances with the society in which the author lives, and above all, the impact that society may have had on his style. In this sense, the personality of the writer's individuality, takes on a primal role. Similar intuitions later shape the work of Victor Vinogrado, who developed the concepts of the image of the author, obras avtor, and the authorial position, after Stephenson. The historical context, of course, was not favorable that to Tomaszewski, Tinianov, Eichenbaum, and also Vinogrado, in consolidating the concept of literary personality. As we know, the late 20s were not into fully paradoxic. Already actually in the very beginning of the 30s, when the debate around the literary factor just arose. But basically what we can just stress is the central role played by the personality, authorship, personality, biography. How does Vinatour take part, let's say, in this scenario, this panorama? Let me also provide here a very brief biographical profile of Vinatour to situate his background, the environments in which he worked, and how he came to write biography and culture. He was born in Warsaw. He belongs to the same family, the same generation of Fontiansky. Then he moved to Moscow at the very beginning of the 20th century. Later, he attended secondary school, enrolled in the faculty of philology in the 10th in Moscow. His professor, the linguist Dmitry Shakov, introduced him from the very first year to the Moscow Dialectological Commission. As a student, Vinatour devoted himself almost exclusively to linguistics and became associated with the Moscow Linguistic Circle, the Moskovsky Linguisticzny Krужок, MLK, a student group founded among others by Roman Jakobson, which basically we can just roughly summarize so to impose the supremacy of linguistics over literal studies. And they tend to represent the counterpart of the upheavals in Petrograd. Then Vinatour served as president of the MLK at the very beginning of the 20s. So trained linguists by the mid-20s, Vinatour, together with Jakobson, embodied the theoretical methodological orientation characteristic of the so-called Moscow formalism. And then a turning point is in 1924 when he took part in the work of the Gartner, and within its series he published Biography and Culture in 1927. Within the guard, Vinacour was among those who incredibly embraced the lesson of philosopher Gustav Spietz, who was responsible for the systematic introduction into Russia of Edmund Husserl's legacy and phenomenology. Then in the 30s, Vinacour taught at various institutes and universities in Moscow. He also worked on the Dictionary of Russian Language of the Academy of Sciences, eventually published in 1909, 2 years after his death. What about the biography and culture? Why is such a seminal research in, or just understanding Vinacour's idea of personality? First of all, biography and culture began as a lecture delivered by Vinacour in October 1924 at the Garden. He reworked in July 1926, and it appeared in French in 1927. And then first, Vinacour plays a concept of biography, biografiia, at the center of his critical reflection, rejecting the idea that biography was merely a description of life. Connected with biography, we also find two other details in his research: personality, lichnost, and avtor. And one element to emphasize is the fact that Vinacour does not approach the question of biography in a theological sense. That is, we usually think of it as a rigorous reconstruction of facts and events. Not in a philosophical one. Vinacour referred instead to the most recent philosophy of life and to phenomenology, drawing directly on Husserl and above all on Gustav Spietz. You should remember that with Spietz, Vinacour collaborated very actively during the 20s within the framework of the Garden. And in biography and culture, Vinacour shifts the focus from the objective description of events to the personal experience lived by the individual. What then is biography for Vinacour, and how can we define then personality? Biography, first of all, is defined as a structure. So here the term already evocates Tinianov and Jakobson, and it will be interesting in the future to compare the visions and see how they converge or diverge. Within this structure, two elements interact with Vinacour. The forma, which for Vinacour is the social reality, that is what defines the external material of biography, and the object, предмет, namely the author's personality in becoming. And here I add in becoming, because for Vinacour, as for Kupiansky, history is the point of reference, not to be understood as a random sequence of events, but as the process through which certain events are formed and take place. For Vinacour, history itself would also become a phenomenology of history. So, biography in Vinacour's reading has two main concepts. It is a synthesis between form and object, that is, between social reality and the author's personality in becoming. And it is defined as objectivated form. Предметная форма, that is, as the relationship between history and personality, lichnost, in which the lived experience, переживание, intervenes and is defined as the synthesis. So the synthesis, the inner form of the biographical structure, what Vinacour calls внутренняя форма биографической структуры. Внутренняя форма. And here, внутренняя форма, we can see the shared notion of inner form, a theme to which I shall return. In this definition of biography, therefore, two other key concepts on which Vinacour says. So synthesis for inner form and personality. And in formulating these two conceptual nuclei, Vinacour brings together his entire training as a linguist and his intellectual depth to Spiel's teaching. The first concept, synthesis, or inner form, as its close precedent, the Humboldtian idea of synthesis, which goes well beyond the alien meaning, expressing all the diversity of human language construction. Humboldt is in fact one of the most frequently cited authors in biography and culture. Humboldt's idea that everything in language is synthesis serves as a prelude to introducing the concept later taken up in Russia by Spiel, and to which Vinacourt himself is deeply indebted, of the inner form of language, innere Sprachform, so literaturnaia forma. For Humboldt, language unites two elements of a concrete structure, two terms of a relation. The entity of pure sound, which in Vinacourt's formulation becomes social reality, and the entity of thought, which for Vinacourt becomes the personality in becoming. One takes up Humboldt's thesis, and Vinacourt highly esteemed is the philosopher Spiel, author, among other linguistic and philosophical studies, of the inner form of the word, studies and variations on Humboldtian themes, which was dated 1927. Following Humboldt's teachings, Spiel defines a form of language as a spiritual unity that binds together the individual elements considered as raw material. In opposition to the Archaeas group, Spiel maintains that the essence of language, and consequently the study of literature, cannot be reduced to external structure or grammatical construction. Its two characteristics reveal themselves in the general course of the development of languages themselves. So language is like a crystal which manifests itself at once as a progressive and regular formation. Vinacourt adopts the linguistic and philosophical legacy of Humboldt and Spiel and identifies the idea of inner form with one of the elements that determines the biography of the writer, the lived experience, so the pied. This lived experience, also called the inner form of the biographical structures, is nothing other than the comprehension of one's own self in something external and the transformation of the self in the very process of comprehension. So there's a synthesis between history and the personality of the author. In this process of constructing biography, Vinacourt accords great importance to the reality external to the author, society. This does not mean, however, that all historical and social facts algebraically enter into the biography of a writer. On this point, Vinacourt establishes selection criteria for the biographer and argues that for a historical fact to become biographical, it must resonate with the lived experience. That is, with the experience lived by consciousness, a kind of awareness to which Theory had referred. In descriptive psychology, a word cited many times in biography and culture, Theory insisted that descriptive psychology does not reduce experience to mere causal connections or stimulus and response, but seeks instead to describe and analyze the structures of lived experience. The starting point is not abstractions or general laws, but the physical mind as it gives itself in the immediacy of lived experience. For Vinacourt, however, pied must not be understood as a psychological phenomenon, but as the set of elements that have a decisive and substantial impact on the poetic formation of language of the individual writer. In biography and culture, it gives a concrete example by referring to the death of Napoleon, an external event to any given author's biography. When writing about Napoleon's death, Vinacourt affirms that it is at once a political event in the history of Europe and an event of great relevance in the personal life and poetic stylistic practice of a writer like Rushdie. Similarly, the abolition of serfdom, another external social event, becomes as much a phase of class struggle in Russia as it is an event in the personal life of Turgenev or Herzen. So here we can see our directly put in biography and culture when Vinocourt just talks about the impact of Napoleon's death on Pushkin's life. So he talks about skąta fakt licznej жизни. Again, licznej жизни, so the lichnost. And also факт особой биографии, сколько событий в личной жизни дерева или девцы. And he talks about социальная действительность. So this external social life which has a very strong impact on their biography. From this point of view, Napoleon's death is just as much as the effect of the political history of Europe as it is a fact of Pushkin's personal life. And the abolition of serfdom in 1861 is just as much a famous class struggle in Russia for the personal life of Turgenev for Ibsen. So the transformation of an external effect into an event in the personal life is explained by Vinocourt partly in the terms of formal method, especially the upheavals. Vinocourt writes that personality is like an artist who molds and stamps his life in the form of experiences from the material of the surrounding reality. So just above, he recalls another intellectual tradition because he writes experience is the inner form of the biographical structure. So we can see that Spiez's legacy is always quoted. For Vinocourt, external events, as well as the actions and behaviors of an individual, are significant for personal life only insofar as they have been in some way lived by the individual. Either because they elicited a resonance on this part, this is the predicative function, or because they were performed by him and thus express the style of his behavior. This is the expressive function. These two functions contribute to shaping an individual's or an author's personality. Personality, therefore, is the author's biography, and in turn determines his biography. It is determined from both a historical and a phenomenological perspective. Historical, because it depends on the concatenation of events, on their process, but above all on the different stages of history, its evolution. Phenomenological, because, as mentioned, personality is closely linked to experience. And experience is not a simple psychological fact or an observable external event, but the way in which reality appears to the conscience of subject, immediately and in the first person. There is a phenomenon that arises in the side of personality, which is not limited to biography alone. According to Vinocourt, when observed at a precise historical moment, the author's personality makes it possible to analyze his style and thus the tendencies through which artistic form is expressed in that particular historical moment. And I consider this passage a crucial point in the elaboration of Vinocourt's conceptual system, because here Vinocourt comes to conceive the idea of personality and style. So this close relationship between personality, richness, and style still. By linking individuality with history, the macro dimension of the individual with the macro dimension of the collective. And that's why Vinocourt applies the stylistic method developed in his earlier works, arriving at the interpretation of styles and manners as expressions, and one singular and social. In other words, personality, understood as biographiia, defines an author's style, and in turn, a writer's style, as an expression of personality, is shaped by social factors. I'm just Concluding, for lichnost, personality that becomes a particular historical object, which must be situated along the timeline of history and studied not in a static sense, as a mere accumulation of events, but dynamically, in close relationship with the unfolding of history. In short, the historical moment changes and personality changes with it. The relation between personality and history is defined as syntacticity, a term clearly derived from his earlier linguistic studies. This syntax is connected to the concept of structure and is determined by the relationship between the members composing the biographical structure, personality, and history. It allows a reconstruction not only of the biography of an individual writer, but also of an entire culture generation, what Binacur called kulturne pakani. And that's a true novelty in Binacur studies because you understand why it is important to study personality. The personality of a writer helps us to understand style and the style of his generation, and therefore the culture or cultures of a given historical period. So we can say that Binacur works in concentric circles. It begins from the particular and arrives at the general. First, it defines personality, understood against Kirishivania, then biography, a synthesis of personality, history, and society. Then it determines what individual is, not just an individual, but a writer. And finally, he arrives at the concept of cultural generation, an ensemble of writers who are protagonists of a given historical moment. This inductive procedure will lead in directly to the studies of the literary language, literaturnaia, in particular to the essay Język literatury i literaturny język, published by Maxim Shapiri, Literaturniczkie Исследования. On the basis of these convictions, Binacur also wrote as an as yet unpublished essay of 1941 entitled Język как предмет литературализма. I found this text in 2011 in the St. Petersburg branch of the archive of the Academy of Sciences. I will not, of course, dwell on it today, and we are still working on it with Alexander Dmitriev. But I believe that although written in 1941, this long essay bears the mark of Binacur studies on personality from the late 20s. The main theoretical idea at its core is precisely the one already expressed in biography and culture. So to understand what constitutes a literary work, therefore, for Binacur, it is essential to reconstruct the author's personality. Personality, here, as we said, is not defined in an abstract or purely theoretical sense, but in relation with history. And I would like to stress a fact I consider of primary importance because in its definition of subjectivity, Binacur is far from conceiving personality and still less style as an individual expression, as a kind of genius of German idealistic philosophy or symbolism, particularly Russian symbolism. Personality as well as style is rooted in history, and style in particular is rooted in historical German linguistic structures. So I must say, just for concluding, that for both Pompiansky and Binacur, the value of history is fundamental. As I have mentioned, Pompiansky begins from the premise that literature as a system can only be read and interpreted in its historical development as an evolution in which genres, styles, and authors enter into dialogue and form a canon. The literary canon is then questioned, broken, re-elaborated, as happens with Jarry, Fuchs, and so on, thereby opening the way to new forms. For Binacur, too, history is the key to understanding how styles evolve and how the author's personality, his lived experience, changes over time. Most scholars thus adopt a diachronic perspective, study literature in its transformations across time, in the moments when the canon, whether stylistic or generic, is formed, and those moments when it is disrupted and reconstituted. However, despite this convergence, Pugliese and Vinacourt adopt different methods and pursue different ends. For Pugliese, as I noted, it is not enough to define the style of an author at a given moment. But it is necessary to understand its origins and subsequent development. For him, stylistics, even historical stylistics, is an instrument for the history of concepts. For Vinacourt, by contrast, stylistics is both method and scope. One must grasp how the styles of writers develop in light of the social and historical processes in which they live. Vinacourt also shows clear philosophical influences. We have recalled Husserl, Scheer, that the idea of a stylistic system, a structure that applies as much to biography and personality as to literature. If Pompiansky employs antiquity as a continuous model pattern with which to construct literature, Vinacourt does not in fact assign significant value to the ancient dimension, except in occasional precise references to stylistic characteristics of one author or another. Pompiansky's author emerges from this perspective as the hero of the Argos, a close relative of the classicist poet, but at the same time a great innovator, for he effectively decreases his own death when he says the word to his hero and eventually even stalks into the background to make room for the plotless modernist novel as in Joyce and the other mentioned authors. For Vinacourt, however, it is not so much the author as such who is important, but personality. That is, how extra-literary facts shape the author's biography, his personality, and consequently the creation of the literary work itself. That said, authorship remains central for both. The question of how the author is formed, whether as author or as personality, acquires a crucial role in the style of styles and literary genre. What remains unshakable for both Pompiansky and Vinacourt is the foundation of the individual expression, the relation between the individual and the surrounding social historical context, both within the text and beyond it. In that respect, I agree with Vinacourt when he writes that what does not change is the condition of the philologist. He always remains a historian. Sometimes a historian of law, sometimes a historian of language, and sometimes a historian of biography or of personality. He is and always will remain a historian. In conclusion, what emerges from the parallel between Pompiansky and Vinacourt is a shared conviction, the necessity of grounding literary analysis in history. Both regard literature not as an isolated phenomenon, but as a process, a movement in which styles, genres, authors, and indeed personalities are formed and transformed in dialogue with their social and cultural environment. Taken together, these two perspectives illuminate how Russian intellectual history in the 10th and the 20th anticipated some of the most pressing questions of later literary theory: the relation between author and text, the role of subjectivity in literature, and the conditions under which a work becomes part of a culture history. It is precisely here, I would argue, that lies the enduring significance of both Pompiansky and Vinacourt. They remind us that to study literature is always to study life, and that philologist, as Vinacourt himself put it, remains in the final analysis a historian. Thank you for listening, and this is the end of my talk.
Thank you so much for this really education, and I certainly knew for Pompiansky and Vinacourt, but to me these not even secondary, but maybe tertiary characters, Umpiansky, obviously in the shadows of him, but not even one of the few scholars, not maybe for Washington, but somebody on the periphery of that circle. And similarly, maybe Napoleon, heard about the relation to Parliament, but certainly not one of the primary favorites of Klosky, the Piano taking part. Not even the secondary one, like Tomaszewski or Tom, but somewhere on the periphery of that movement. So thank you for really giving them a personality and listing them from this opinion. I have questions, but I would really first very much like to hear from our audience, the physical audience, the Good Center, but also our virtual audience, and maybe members of our virtual audience would raise their virtual hands if they have questions, or if they prefer, they can also type in the chat box. I can also read, but maybe starting with the people who are here.
Yeah, thank you very much. That was fascinating and extremely educational for the reasons that Wilson just said for me. And because I don't know the material particularly well, my question's kind of general. First, just to remark that it's amazing how much this anticipates, say, French thinking, structuralist, post-structuralist, right down to things like Bach's remarks on style, the combination of, style and authorship and how those things go together. So that's really, really striking. And so I guess my question is, could you reflect on why Russian thinkers were so attentive to this, seemingly much earlier than others? And just what are the factors that encourage this? Thank you.
Thank you very much for your very crucial question, because that was one of the questions I tried to understand when I started working on this, not only personalities, but on this intellectual panorama, because also the Vayazovцы and also the other representatives of the Moscowski linguistic кружок anyway talk about personality, even though using different words, different terms. I would say, and I'm pretty sure about it, that first from the very beginning of the 20th century, thanking also the previous heritage, the previous legacy, there's a particular attention to the word. So words, so smaller, if we understand with this term, the creative, the artistic dimension of the word. So if the slova is at the center of the creative, artistic dimension, third scholars try to understand what we have beyond the word and what we have behind it. So they try to understand how the word, in the artistic way, arises and anyway takes shape. What role so the personality has and plays in this process, and so what is the relationship between the different authors and the poets and also authors of prose with the word. So they all of them try to understand what we have behind and beyond the word. If we think about ultraacneism and Duchamp, so we are not talking only about the theoretical scholars, so the theoretically, let's say, panorama, but we're also talking about poets, like Van Duchamp in ultraacneism, and also Klebnikov or Kucholik. So they all try to understand the nature of the word. And that is the reason why I think it is really it is a challenge for them to understand how the creative word takes shape and what kind of role it plays in the artistic creation. That is the reason why all these scholars try to give a theoretical foundation, a theoretical background to the contemporary literature. That is to say, the different literary movements, so acmeism, symbolism, and so on, futurism in the different sources. So they try to understand the contemporary literature, and they need to understand also the relationship in Russian literature between the word and what we have around it, because of course of the nature of the Russian literature itself. So it's like sacral, let's say, feature the Russian word has. Thank you. Very helpful for your question.
Yeah. Yes, thank you so much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. I was really interested by the first part of your talk when you were talking about Kumpiansky and these different shifts in the history of Russian literature that he was accounting for, going from Lomonosov to Державин to Pushkin. And I was curious to hear you speak a little bit more about how exactly he sees these shifts happening, or what is precipitating these shifts. Right? What was the relationship between the literary sphere and maybe the social sphere, the historical sphere? It's making me think of someone like Tynyanov, his concept of ustanovka, right? Where there's, this oratorical orientation with Lomonosov, and then we shift from that to the kind of more intimate salon-based orientation of someone like Державин, and that might explain why there becomes this rise of subjectivity. So I'm curious if he has a certain similar connection that he identifies, and if he does, what the general significance he attributes to that connection is.
Yeah. Thank you for this very fundamental question, because it allows me to also just say a couple words on this process, which I will share with you. I know this important from my point of view slides. And then I will always answer to your question, because as you can see here, I try to summarize this process from the antiquity to the, let's say, the 19th century, even though Kumpiansky goes also beyond Turgenev. So he talks about also Yulia Lereshak, so the contemporary literature of the 20th. So I'm very there are lots of mutual points between, I would say, Tynyanov's Ustanovka and this concept of old by Kumpiansky, even though there are different approaches. Because if we think about the older Kakaratorska genre, Tynyanov pays a particular attention, as you said, to the declamation, so to the fourth. So the approach is more formal in terms of studying not the process, but each particular feature of the odes. So when you mention especially Mayakovsky, so when he compares Mayakovsky's poetry with the 18th century ode, Kumpiansky has a different approach, because of course he's interested in the stylistic features, but on the other hand, what he's interested in is the process of, and how the poet, especially Lomonosov, innovates and especially creates the general vote. There's another main point which I couldn't mention, of course, in this talk, which is definitely crucial for understanding Lomonosov's ode from Kumpiansky's point of view. That is to say, the so-called German Niemiecka Szkoła Razuma. So in some essays about the Russian classicism, and there is a very important difference between Tynyanov and Kumpiansky, Kumpiansky argues that Lomonosov's style somehow depends on the German poets, at Kurt. And so he tries to compare how Lomonosov's style, Lomonosov ode, was created in Russian field, in Russian court. For Tignano, it's not important. So this, let's say, comparative approach, it basically focuses on the formal features of the ode, so the declamation, Ustanovka, trying also to, of course, like shaping a theory when we talk about literary evolution and so on. So they are somehow similar, but on the other hand, they have different perspectives. And also this particular study on Lomonosov and Virginie, which are definitely different from Tignano's essays on old essays. Did I answer your question?
Other question, virtual audio. Because we have a question of my own, which actually picks up from point you with which you began, but which I'm also echoed about how much of their ideas related to French structure, even post structure, even ideas of the author, and I'm curious, and that leads me to the question of the reception of Urganski and Vinocourt in Western scholarship prior to Europe, and on whether I assume none of their works were translated, and so and we have a certain idea of how Russian formalism made it to France, or how Bakhtin was regarded, but I assume Vinocourt and Urganski were not part of that recovery, and I wonder, how, whether we can make any direct connection between these two characters and French.
Yes, thank you, Roxanne. I would say, unfortunately, as far as concerned French legacy, they did not have any kind of reception because, first of all, they were not translated, and first of all, because with the exceptions of some essays, at least about Urganski, published during the 30s, then after Urganski's death, his writings were not published until the end of the 70s. So it was pretty late. And they were published in Russian, and they did not see any kind of reception. They were not translated. And also, as far as concerned Vinocourt, because, of course, Flavievsky's Исследования were published in 1999, so it was pretty late again for the reception of the French structuralists and post-structuralists. But what we can do, for example, with these two main figures is that, as far as concerned Urganski, we can compare Urganski's approach with, it is of course a typological comparison, but we can compare what Urganski did with his Begriffsgeschichte with Ernst Curtius, which was published, the literature of the medieval ages was published during the end of the later during the 40s, birth, and in Ernst Curtius' book, we find a chapter completely entirely devoted to muses. So he also tries, but of course he did not know Urganski, that's evident. But it's clear. But anyway, it's a typological comparison. As far as concerned Vinocourt, we can, of course, compare Vinocourt's writings with, for example, Amalia Casson's ones. That would be very fruitful. That would be a very fruitful path, which still deserves attention, because also Vinocourt talks about, for example, functions in the late 30s, in the middle of 30s. So it would be very important to compare them. These two Russian scholars, with Jakobson, everybody knows about it, had a very
great resonance and success, recent great success in Europe and beyond. But it would be very important to compare these approaches, these perspectives in the Russian context, but also in the European ones, just to understand how Russian scholarship, how Russian literary criticism anticipated all the theories that then in the Western countries has been developing since in the 50s and the 60s. So it will be very fruitful, important, even though sometimes it is only a typological comparison, because of course these texts were not translated.
Thinking domestically within Soviet philology, can we trace the influence of these two and the conceptions of authorship and personality, respectively, within Russian philology?
Yes, it makes sense. Of course, it does. Sure. And it will be again it will be a challenge because I think that reconstructing the idea of authorship since the 20s, also within the Marxist approaches, for example, in studies published in the late 20s, will allow to understand how the role of personality, lichnost, not only within the formalist or bias group perspective, but also in other contexts, how the authorship was studied and how it was presented and discussed. Also in other circles, such as the sociological perspective, we mentioned before, like Kogan, and also avtor in sociological politics, what role the author has in the creation of the word, literature. So, of course, the history of authorship as a concept, again, as a discussion within the domestic panorama, still deserves a renewed attention. And it would be very important to research this part.
Do we have other questions from our virtual audience? Well, I'm sure they will arise informally as we end with the formal section of this research. Thank you so much, Joseph.
So actually listening to me for all your questions. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it. Thank you.